We're going to talk today about beekeeping, what is it, and deciding if it's right for you. I think before you get started and purchasing equipment, purchasing suits, and all those good things, having a real time to consider whether it is absolutely the right thing in your lifestyle and in your location, etc., is a really good place to start. I think one of the big things about beekeeping is that essentially it is livestock management, so it does require a fair amount of time and effort and knowledge. It is not set and forget. So you might have gotten interested in beekeeping from a Flow Hive ad on social media, and those are a fantastic invention that has changed and brought beekeeping really to the forefront of people's minds. But there's a lot that goes around it, and so you need to really think about whether beekeeping is the right thing for this stage of your life.
And the Flow Hive ads focus on turning the knob and getting the honey out, but there's a huge amount of work and understanding and knowledge and care for the bees and preparation that's required before you even grow your colony to the point of being able to get any honey. So as we mentioned in our last video, we didn't get any honey in the first year.
Yeah.
So it wasn't until we'd been working quite hard over a full year before we saw honey.
Yes. Your local area will have apiary codes. We're here in Victoria, Australia, and in Australia we have the apiary code guide for beekeepers and regulations, and that really it obliges anyone who keeps bees to manage the health of their hive and prevent swarms, preventing nuisance to your neighbors or to the general public, and also to manage your hives so pests and diseases are under control as well, because they can spread to other colonies and affect other beekeepers' hives and feral hives.
And it's important to remember that you're part of a larger ecosystem. So whatever you do in your hives, those bees can interact and will interact with other bees. And so if there is disease, or even if there's a neglected hive, it can start to affect other hives in your area. And depending on where you are in the world, there's some very serious diseases that can infect hives, and a neglected hive can actually then end up being a contributor to taking out thousands of other hives. So your role is important in terms of being a beekeeper and keeping on top of it. And that's an important consideration. Do you actually have enough time to manage your bees?
Bees don't always do what we want them to or expect them to do, so you have to have some sort of flexibility. Sometimes the weather doesn't cooperate, so if you work a 9-to-5 job Monday to Friday, and Saturday, Sunday is when you'll inspect, but for whatever reason the weather patterns are that it's rainy and awful or cold on those days, then you might have to have some flexibility in checking your hives, particularly in times when you need to check them more often, like spring.
So that's right. If you're preventing swarming and the only normal windows that you'd have when you weren't working were terrible days to inspect the bees, it might mean you actually need to come home early that day from work, or get up early and inspect the bees. So that's something I think most people don't expect, and we've certainly had to work around that a fair amount.
Yes.
Several times a year. It's a bit inconvenient. Yeah.
And weather affects the timing of the things that you're doing, and the bees just will sometimes decide that they've made a change, and then you have to respond to it, and respond, not necessarily urgently always, but within some timely manner.
And for those reasons, beekeeping is probably not for somebody who does a lot of traveling, especially if you aren't flexible about when you travel. So spring is the most time-intensive part of the year for beekeeping, and so you pretty much can't travel in the spring if you keep bees, unless you have somebody else who can step in for you and do those inspections and maintain the hives. So that's sort of the livestock management section that we thought of. The next thing we thought we'd talk about is a little bit about how much time is actually required. So in spring, how long would you say you would need? How much time in spring?
So I think if you separate out inspection times versus all of the other tasks that you need to do in terms of picking up equipment or making your own equipment, so frames, building, all of those kinds of things. If you have 1 or 2 hives, you could probably expect 1 or 2 hours per week in spring, so in swarming season, to be checking your hives well for signs that they're about to swarm and then preventing swarms.
And when you're a new beekeeper, you spend a lot more time because every frame you're learning what you're looking for and what's normal and what's not. So
yeah,
you can slowly decrease your inspection times over time, but it still does take a fair amount of time.
Yeah, and I mean, that's the thing about beekeeping is that you're often so excited. So that's not a big imposition because you're thinking about it, you're excited, you want to spend as much time looking at the bees as you can. I didn't find that it was a big imposition.
No, we both love it. Nick is usually the one that's in the hives. As you can see, the hives are right behind us here. This is our dining room window, and so we have the incredible luxury of being able to have the hives right outside our dining room window, and I can be on the inside, usually on a phone with earphones in, and we talk to each other, and I take notes and comment, Nick
and
listens
give
to
advice.
yes. Nick listens to my advice and discards it. No, actually, we have a good banter back and forth.
Yeah.
But it's it takes the two of us, doesn't it? I mean, it really is quite helpful to have the two minds even thinking about things, because I've certainly been in the bee suit and doing inspections and being in that suit and being surrounded by bees. It's a whole other level of things you need to process, and there's a pressure, there's a physical pressure, and there's a sort of an environmental pressure around doing that. So it's actually helpful to have another person there who's helping along.
So, and that would be for maybe 1 or 2 hives. Obviously, if you get really excited and have heaps of hives, then it'll be more time in the spring.
Yep.
You should be inspecting in the spring. We'll probably talk about swarm prevention, but every 7 to 10 days. So if you're going to prevent queens from hatching and your hive from swarming, then every 7 to 10 days in the spring you'll be looking at your bees.
And then in summer and in fall that drops down, and it depends a little bit on how much of a nectar flow there is. So a nectar flow is when there's a lot of nectar in the flowers, and the bees are bringing a lot of nectar back to the hive. And when that happens, they can create a lot of wax, and they use up a lot of space very quickly, and so there's a lot more activity needed on the beekeeper's end in order to make sure that you're arranging the hive in a way that's most efficient for them, and taking out honey if you need to.
Yeah. And
so that's every 2 to 3 weeks if it's not that busy, but again, you could go right back down to that 7 to 10 days requirement when there is a nectar flow.
Or if you're in a drought, you might be able to extend that to 4 or 5 or 6 weeks even, if you're having a really bad weather summer and into the fall.
And again, it's a little bit unpredictable with nectar flows, because it's not just the season itself, but it's the weather that then drives how much nectar there is, and then thus the bees respond to that. And it's different in every area, so you might try and look up nectar flow times, but you need to be very specific about what's happening in your particular area within a 5K radius where the bees can fly to, and what things are available to them.
Yes, yeah. You might see a lot of flowers, but they might not be nectar producing. In Australia, we have a lot of eucalyptus type species of trees, and they don't flower and give nectar every year. They might be every 2 to 3 years. So if you're thinking about getting bees in Australia, you have to think about what kind of flora do you have around you. Is it all eucalypt that will only flower every 3 years, or are you in a more suburban location where you have gardens that have all sorts of flowering plants pretty much every year that your bees can rely on? So those are all things to think about. In the winter time, once you've packed them down for winter, you shouldn't be opening the hive under about 15 or 16 degrees at the very coldest. Warmer would be better. And so you can spend your winter basically vacationing or building, getting ready for the season, building frames, doing reading, watching videos, thinking about what your plans are.
Yeah. And the bees, depending on where you live, are either almost inactive, you won't see them at all, or if you're in Australia and it's relatively warm in comparison to most of the world, you will still see them active, but at maybe 10% of what they would normally be.
Yeah.
But they're not doing a lot in the hive that would make a difference.
Yeah. And if you're in the northern hemisphere, you might need to think about what you do with them if you're in a place that gets down to -10 and below degrees Celsius.
Some beekeepers we follow will even bring all their hives indoors, not indoors like in a fully heated environment, but in an environment that's
temperature controlled.
less cold than -20 degrees Celsius or something.
Yeah, so that they don't use too much of their stores over the winter time, that they can control things. So, and we'll obviously only have experience in Australia, so we'll talk particularly about the kind of Australian climate in Victoria, where it is fairly dry, can get up to at least 3 or 4 days in a row over 40 degrees Celsius in the summertime. And then in Melbourne, where we are, maybe it gets down to 2, 3, 4 degrees at night in the depth of winter, only for a few days though, so it's pretty temperate for us coming from Canada.
It's easy for the bees.
Yes, yeah.
Then there's a number of things that are around beekeeping that take some considerable time that you need to factor in as well. One of those is extraction of honey, which you will probably be quite excited to do, but it does take some time. The actual extraction itself, so we just did one a couple of weeks ago. We had 17 frames of honey, and that took about 5 hours. So by the time you get out the equipment, make sure that it's absolutely clean, do the extraction, and we'll talk in another video and show you the actual extraction process. But then collect all the honey and then clean jars and put it in jars, and all of that is quite time consuming. So factor in that in your life as well, in terms of how much time it takes. And then finally are the other things like building stands for the beehives, building frames. Depending on how quick you are, it can take 5 or 10 minutes to build one frame, which doesn't sound like a lot, but when you start to have 2 or 3 hives, you actually have, you sort of need to make in spring 60 frames or 50 frames or much larger quantities, and then that time ends up adding up quite a bit.
Yep.
And then, as you mentioned earlier, there's the driving to pick up equipment, which is often what you need to do, because shipping large items isn't nearly as affordable as it should be, and then certain things like wax don't ship very well. So you often have to drive to the local beekeeping supply.
Yeah. Once you're in the hobby quite a bit and you're taking quite a lot of honey off, you'll end up with, I'd say the main byproduct other than honey is beeswax, and you can choose lots of things to do with beeswax, and so you need to clarify it, clean it, and then decide what you're going to do with it. Either make candles if you like making candles, or selling it, or you can do things like beauty products or furniture polish. There's lots of stuff that you can make with beeswax, and so that takes its time and a little bit of money as well.
So I'd say quite reliably, you tell me if you agree, we would spend an average of somewhere between 1 to 3 hours per week. Even if we're not inspecting a hive, we're probably doing something in relation to beekeeping.
Yeah.
Would you say that's right?
Yeah.
So that's sort of an average. Probably a full average would be about 2 hours a week.
I agree.
But some weeks might be nothing, and other weeks might be 5 or 6 hours or 3 hours or something like that.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah.
And then the final thing that we thought was worth including as part of being a beekeeper is the educational component of it.
Yes. In terms of your educating others. So once you get into this hobby and you have bees, all of a sudden people will ask you all sorts of stuff about bees. You'll have to do a lot of educating around your neighbors. And I think sometimes you'll be compelled to re-educate people's misconceptions about bees. So neighbors might need some help, and friends might need some help understanding bee behavior and what's going on. And
the difference between bees and wasps.
Yep.
That's we were actually quite surprised at how many people are confused about wasps and bees and think that wasps are bees most of the time.
Yes, yeah. We actually got called this year by a friend of ours who said, I think a bunch of wasps have come to our doorstep. And when we actually got a photo of it, it was a swarm of bees. And so we went down and collected it. So that was quite...
And neighbours had even confirmed that it was a collection of wasps.
Wasps, yeah.
But wasps don't do that at all. It's totally a bee behaviour.
Yeah, exactly. So swarm collection, if you happen to come across a swarm in swarming season, you might need to re-educate the homeowner of where it is, or people that are walking by, and so that people can have some understanding of what swarming is, and what it isn't really, and that they don't really have a whole lot to be afraid of.
Especially when bees are swarming, they're quite safe.
They're quite docile, and correcting the misconceptions that people often have. So as soon as you know a little bit, I'm sure you'll be passing that on.
So it's obviously not a formal requirement of beekeeping, but we find it's become a fairly significant and consistent part of our beekeeping, and we love it.
Yeah.
Hence the videos here. But yeah, yeah, it's definitely a consideration. You'll end up talking about bees a lot.
Yeah.
So, shall we talk a little bit about education and where to start?
Yep.
And then we can, in our next video, talk a little bit about costs.
Mm-hmm. Yep. So as part of the starting your beekeeping journey, that's such an overused word nowadays, but part of this is your education. So some of our suggestions are, if you're not much of a reader, there's lots of books, but if you're not much of a reader, then you can find lots of YouTube videos. I would look around on YouTube for, say, Nick Cannell's Beekeeping Adventures.
Yeah, that's a good one.
That's a good YouTube channel. But there'll be lots and lots of different beekeepers who do things differently, from commercial beekeepers to hobbyists, to people who've had 40, 50 years of beekeeping experience, to those who are just new to it as well. So find one that you think works well with your style, and your location as well.
Yes.
Also, there will be people who beekeep in a rural environment versus a suburban or urban environment even. So, finding videos that are have more in common with your particular situation is a good thing. And also everybody will have a different style, so just pick some that you enjoy watching.
And
you'll get all sorts of interesting little tidbits out of lots of videos. So we watch lots of beekeeping videos. And
although you won't fully feel like you're 100% ready before you get your bees, please don't get bees until you have a fairly good working knowledge. You need to be able to identify the types of bees in your hive. You need to understand considerations around location. You need to understand what an inspection is and what you're doing as part of an inspection. You need to understand the parts of the hive, and all these things we're going to cover in some more detail in another video for you. But it will become very overwhelming if you get bees and you have not done the basics. So, and that one of the ways to get the basics is to go to a course as well. That's a really great way. There's nothing like working with an experienced beekeeper who can walk you through their thought process and what they're seeing and what it means and what they're doing and why.
Yeah.
So, and we'll do some of that as well, won't we?
Yes.
Yeah.
So you can join a club. So join a bee club. Our local bee club have members who join before they get bees, because that can be a way that you get a group of bees, and we can talk about how we do that. and taking a course or a class. And then if you're part of a bee club and you meet experienced beekeepers, then you can often volunteer to go along to an inspection, and if they're open and willing to have an extra pair of hands. You might not get a full-on lesson, but at least walking around in the bee suit, having the bees around you, and seeing if you're really well suited to being in the suit and spending some time and really managing. And you can hold a frame of bees and have a look, and just learn a few things and get used to what it might be like.
It's quite nerve-wracking at first. It can feel quite overwhelming, but you'll get a sense pretty quickly whether it's exciting and you want to do more, or whether it just feels like this is not something you want to do. And watching a video is very different than experiencing it. Yeah. Even standing on this side of the window with Nick on the other side of the window is a very different experience. So get involved and be close to some bees before you make your decision.
Yes, yeah. Particularly if you have maybe some sensory sensitivities, being in a very occlusive suit can be a bit overwhelming.
Yep, it gets quite hot and stuffy.
Yep.
If it's warm outside, even if it's mild and sort of a nice spring day, it can get quite warm.
Yep.
It can feel claustrophobic for some people.
Yep.
Yeah. We're not trying to be negative about it, because none of these things are issues really for us, but we think they're important considerations, because we could see how they would definitely be an issue for some. And we've seen some people who've reacted very strongly, and it's been a bit further down the road.
And I do belong to a bunch of Facebook groups or social media groups about beekeeping, and you do see over the course of the spring and the summer somebody who's asking some very junior questions, and maybe they're a bit over their head, and then you see that their beekeeping equipment's up for sale. So they probably purchased everything before they really truly knew whether they were going to be happy doing beekeeping, which we'd like to save you from any, you'll lose money if you buy everything new and then sell it used to other beekeepers. So save you some money.
Yep. Yeah, definitely. And try, you mentioned clubs, but try, so we found in Melbourne, to our surprise, that there were many clubs. Usually they're regional based, so they're in all the different regions, but there were far more clubs than we imagined there would be. And you don't need to stick to the club that's in your region if it's not the right club for you. And they each had their own flavor. They each had their own group of people, and so do more than one club. If you find the first club is not to your liking, try a different club and sort of shop around a little bit till you feel like you fit in with that group.
Yeah. Often in Australia anyways, there's where you can join for a year, or you can usually first or second visit to the club meetings free, and then you can have a drop-in club fee as well. So our club is $5 if you want to just drop in and you don't want to become a member for the year. So you can shop around, find a group that you really click with and understand and are welcoming, because everybody's different. And
and ideally, when you're part of those groups, see if you can find a mentor. So see if you can, we're really excited to help other beekeepers, so see if you can find other people who are excited to do that and can hold your hand a little bit through everything from recommendations on where to get supplies to coming and joining you for your first or second inspection, so that you have a bit of a hands-on experience with somebody. It's not always easy. Sometimes you have to pay for mentors, so there's people who offer that as a service, which is worth it. If you had to pay $50 or $100 to have somebody take you through, that is absolutely worth it. Certainly we have done that as well.
Yeah.
We've used a really fantastic lady who has every time she's come out has taken our knowledge and our ability to a whole other level just by being here for an hour or an hour and a half.
Yeah.
So very, very much worth it.
And you don't necessarily need them to do everything. You just even talking about what they're thinking as they're looking through, and you're doing your inspection and they're there helping you. just thinking out loud or talking out loud about what they're thinking can just level up your knowledge and your experience. And I think be mindful that there'll be people who have the ability to provide mentorship for free.
Yep.
And there'll be people that beekeeping and honey sales is their sole source of income, and they may not be able to be a mentor for free and pay for it. If you find someone you really work well with and like, and they need to make money and make a living, pay them for their time, because it's really well worth it.
Yep. And there's nothing like being able to pick up the phone or send a text and say, I've got a quick question, and have a relationship built up with somebody.
Yeah.
When you're struggling to figure out what the next thing to do is. And we've been in that situation a number of times.
Yeah.
So see if you can connect with others.
When your hive swarms for the first time and you
That's right.
need
and you're
somebody
looking out the window and thousands of bees
are pouring out of the hive.
Yeah.
Having somebody on the end of the phone that says, okay, it's okay, this happens.
Yeah.
We can deal with it. Just this is what you need to do.
That's right.
And gives you a virtual slap on the back that you can do this is worth its weight in gold.
And the final thing we thought we would mention in terms of prepping and deciding whether you're ready is to find some suppliers.
Yep.
If we use our area as an example, there's probably maybe 8 or so fairly significant suppliers that are either within the state or in a nearby state, and they have varying amounts of stock and a variety of stock and a varying amount of price, and also quite a significant variance in their customer service level. And so it's been actually really great for us to find a great couple who run a great business, who are not the cheapest but who are phenomenal at customer service, and that makes all the difference in the world if we need to arrange to pick up a whole bunch of supplies at 6 p.m. after work, and she'll leave them out for us to pick up and so on. So before you even start, rather than relying on Amazon or sort of those no-name brand beekeeping supply avenues, try and find a local small business if possible, or at least a business that's really switched on and helpful.
Yeah.
And use them as your supplier. And we need to keep those small businesses alive. This is a community of small business. Even the bigger beekeepers are still fairly small in the scheme of things. So it's important to support them.
And also they're often a great source of information. So we needed to buy some queens for our hive and another hive of a friend of ours. And our first go-to was to ask our beekeeping supplier what she thought, who she thought might be selling queens. So, they could be your first. And then I asked my mentor, and she came through. So those connections are really great to have. Otherwise, you might not get the right thing, equipment or package or whatever for you. So really important.
So next time we'll talk about cost a little bit. What are all the costs you need to consider? What are the main startup costs versus the ongoing costs? And we'll get into that a little bit and share what those costs have been for us. So thanks for joining us. Hit like, hit subscribe, please. It helps. The YouTube algorithm favors when you hit like and subscribe, and it gives us an idea of how many people are watching. But more than that, even put some comments in, let us know what you'd like to see, and we'll create some videos for you.
Be kind to one another.
Bye.
Bye.